The Fox 5i team has found historic artifacts that have stood on the grounds of the governor's mansion for more than 100 years, have been destroyed or damaged during work by the state agency that's tasked with keeping up the governor's mansion.
Yeah, Governor Brian Kemp's spokesperson says the damage took place during attempts to move columns and statues that date all the way back to the early 1900s. Senior I-Team reporter Dale Russell has gone back in time to understand what the people of Georgia have lost and how this happened.
Sine, it's really interesting. We talked with 7 historic preservationists about the changes at the mansion. All expressed deep concerns about how the First Family is treating the historical mansion grounds. But the governor's staff aren't even convinced the items in question are even historic. The Georgia governor's mansion sits atop a ridge, overlooking 18 acres of meticulously manicured and professionally landscaped hills.
Welcome to the house, everybody!
9 First Families have lived here.
And it's Georgia Citizens Place.
That's right. It belongs to the citizens.
And the first thing you noticed is the paneling.
Inside the Greek Revival mansion built in 1967,
Most of the furniture in here is from the federal period.
historians tell me the collection of early American furniture
This is more than 200 years old.
is one of the finest in America.
They said Princess Anne slept in here.
Outside, a pristine collection of beautiful historic gardens. History that our investigation found has been either destroyed or displaced. To understand what was lost, we found our way to the Atlanta History Center to examine how it all began. Stacy Catrone, author of a Georgia garden history book, works at the center. She would not talk to us on camera, but agreed to show us the original mansion landscape design. So this is the original plan. It begins with this terraced garden leading to a small fountain or pool. At the time, Atlanta Mayor Robert Maddox owned the property. Historians believe his wife Lolly designed the garden. This is how it looked around 1911. The Maddoxes added 4 17th century Italian statues known as the Four Seasons, according to the book Seeking Eden. Further west was a dirt tennis court, surrounded by concrete columns wrapped in stucco. So the columns around the tennis court were clearly there. Right there in the early 1900s, sturdy enough to support a half pergola draped in climbing roses, according to Stacy Catrone's book, Seeking Eden.
She created something that was a pastoral grounds in the same tradition of, say, Piedmont Park at that time.
Renowned Washington, D.C. landscape architect Charles Birnbaum is an author and expert on the history of landscape architecture. He knows the governor's mansion property well. The state of Georgia bought the Maddox property in the early 60s as the site of the new governor's mansion. Birnbaum says Atlanta-born landscape architect Ed Doherty was hired to design the new landscaping. Doherty, who revered the history of the land, kept the terraced garden intact and designed new gardens, and also kept the tennis court and columns.
It's the work of a master. And what he does is he works with the place that's there to elevate it to the stature of the governor's mansion.
That garden and tennis court columns remained for 50 years through 9 governors. Sandra Deal, who wrote a book about the history of the mansion, told me why she didn't change it. I loved it the way it was. It was so historic, so special. The 17th century Italian statues that surrounded this original pool and the columns that surrounded this original tennis court have both been removed. According to documents obtained through an open records request, the statues were taken to this climate-controlled storage facility here in southwest Atlanta, now tipped over, the pedestals broken apart during the move.
What we're doing is we are altering not just history, but we're sending a message to others that it's okay to tear down.
The governor's spokesperson says the state was only moving the statues so the building authority could use heavy equipment to prune bushes that had grown up around the statues, and that an appraiser told them the statues weren't significant. As for those columns, the building authority, fearing the columns were deteriorating and could be dangerous while people played tennis, asked the state historic preservation officer for an assessment. This is the answer. The columns were historic, and though cosmetically challenged, they were structurally stable. The recommendation, retention and repair of the columns as existing historic features from the Maddox-era ownership of the property. The inspection was done at the very end of March. On April 1st, the building authority began removing the columns The same morning, they got the historic designation answer. They felt it was too late. They called it a communications issue. Governor Kemp's spokesperson says they'd hoped to store the columns, but they fell apart during removal by the building authority, proving they were dangerous. Torn down, broken up into pieces, and hauled off to this garbage transfer station, where those pieces of history ultimately ended up in a landfill. Gone forever. Gone from Lolly Maddox's vision. Gone from Ed Doherty's careful preservation of that vision.
And I think that what's sad is, I think when you start to look at the changes that are happening, it suggests a limited understanding, or worst case, a disregard for the narrative structure that has been in place for the last half century at the governor's mansion.
But there is more. There was also an option to tear out the fountain where the graceful figures once stood. The fountain was damaged by a fallen tree and was sinking in part. One option shows that the fountain would be replaced with this, a modern outdoor amphitheater.
People should stop. People should stop and take stock and understand the quality and the character and the history and the nature and culture of what they've been entrusted to.
Now the building authority staff tells me they have put plans to tear out that fountain where those statues once stood on hold. They want to know more about the history of the garden. Russ?